Do, 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 do. Welcome to the Friends with Benefits podcast, a business podcast about revenue-generating partnerships, not a podcast about business time with friends. We're your co-hosting couple. I'm Jason.
And I'm Sam. Welcome to the show, friends.
Hey, friends. We are super excited about today's episode. It's a bit different than normal. But before we dive in, we have been talking in our little family, our nuclear family, about values. You recently read a book. What was the book that was focused on values and...
Oh, Peak Performance by Brad Stolberg and his co-author. Yeah.
Okay, and the importance of values. You've been talking about this a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it really begins to drive who you are and what you're focused on. They make the point of like establish your core values as yourself, as a family, and whatever you're working on. As you begin to establish those core values, everything you do begins to be wrapped and bottled in those. You learn what to say yes to, what to say no to, based off those core values.
So we haven't even talked about this like off mic, but we've been thinking about how we can help our kids go into the world and tell themselves a good story about themselves. And I think one of really, really rough draft, this is the first time we're talking about this, but I think some of the core values we could instill there is kindness, loyalty, curiosity.
Bravery, curiosity.
Yeah. And I think the importance of having those, as you just said, is like stakes in the ground or frameworks for how you approach the world can really impact the way you view yourself in the world.
Agreed. Yeah, and then they to lead into the episode, like how you live in those core values becomes the story you begin to shape and the narrative you begin to tell yourself and those around you. And like I love a point that Priya made in the episode is that our story is where our confidence comes from. And I don't think you can establish those confidence without understanding like what your values are, what your core values are, and what drives you. If your story becomes your confidence, your story is what builds trust. And if your story builds trust, your story is what brings value. And so she really brought a really good message home around how to build your own story, your own narrative for your life and within your company.
Priya is phenomenal. So I met Priya, just by happenstance, synchronicity as some would call it, at Dreamforce, and we quickly hit it off. I looked at her LinkedIn, and she goes forth as a storytelling expert. So of course, given the conversations we have around our table, I wanted to know more about that. But she started in journalism, actually. She then became a morning show host. She then moved over to be a solutions engineer. She's now at Slack, which is how I met her at Dreamforce.
Small little company.
Yep. And now she's running her own thing over at priyasam.com, which we're going to talk about today. But I think this framework, this idea is so important for all of us in business, in family, in mentorship, in menteeship. And literally everything we do, the stories we tell, frame and shape our world. So
Absolutely. It's my first time meeting her. I thought she was fantastic. Really fascinating conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed as much as we did. Let's get into it.
Hey, friends. Welcome back. I am super excited for today's conversation because this is a very different one from our normal conversations, but I think you're going to love it. So the way this came to be was I was at Dreamforce at a WISE, which is Women in Solution Engineering breakfast. And I had the pleasure of sitting next to our guest today, Priya Sam. Hey, Priya, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Yeah,
Hello.
thanks so much for having me. That was such a fortuitous meeting that we had.
It totally was. And, so Priya, you're currently a solution engineer at Slack, which of course, me working in the Salesforce ecosystem, I was like, that's awesome. Let's chat. And then I looked you up on LinkedIn. I was like, hold the phone, left turn. I want to talk about what you're doing.
Yeah, I feel like I immediately got texted your link, like, check this person out, just met her, we got to get her on the podcast. So it's good to see it actually happening.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I think I think when you think about solutions engineering, obviously you think about a very like technical sales role, which is true. But yes, you're right. My LinkedIn bio is more about storytelling, presenting, which is what I do on sort of on the side. And I mean, there's definitely a lot of crossover, but I love that the storytelling part is what really stood out to you, and that we started to connect over.
Totally.
Yeah,
I mean, I think. Go ahead.
People and storytelling is more of our love language than anything. So looking forward to actually hearing more about it.
Yeah.
So so getting right into it, I guess, like looking through your LinkedIn to bring that all full circle, like you've had quite the journey, quite the level and layers of experience, right? From journalism to national news anchor to morning show host. Like I just wanted like to spend a quick 30-minute documentary on Priya Sam, but talk to me more about like the journey to how you've gotten to now being an expert on helping people and really understanding the power of their own story. Like what did that journey look like for you?
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, my interest in journalism really came from this passion for sharing people's personal stories and I think it just grew. And it started when I was a kid. You know, I was always very curious, always, you know, asking lots of questions, and always wanted to learn. And my parents actually immigrated to Canada. My mom not long before I was born, and my dad when he was 18. So for them, news and media is how they really learned about Canadian culture. And North American culture. So there was always a newspaper on the table, the radio was on, the TV was on for, you know, the dinner time newscasts. So I was really surrounded by it. And the stories I loved the most were about people and, you know, people who overcame obstacles or did something incredible. And so when I was doing my degree in journalism, my passion was to become a reporter so I could have a platform to really elevate the voices of people who were traditionally underrepresented, and to share their stories. And I think that as I moved from journalism into the corporate world, I sort of thought, I don't know if, you know, I'm going to use that skill as much anymore. For me, it was so tied to journalism, and I didn't really understand that there would be any use for it outside of that. But then once I started working in tech sales, I realized like everyone needs this skill. And actually, when you don't have it, it can be really detrimental. Like you can be the best at your job, but if you don't know how to tell a story about it, you don't know how to talk about your accomplishments in an interview, in a networking situation, it can actually really hold you back.
Absolutely. Like, especially in that interview context, like we talk to a lot of people, especially these days, who are, you know, transitions, layoffs and stuff like that, and going in for the interview. And I get asked a lot, like, you know, what questions should we be asking? How do we talk about this? It's like everyone's kind of, you know, wants to present their best foot forward because everyone's looking for a job, it seems like right now. We've all got the open to work banner at some stage in the last 3 years, it feels like. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Sam,
the thing that really stood out to me when we first met was, I think the way you described it was when you were at a networking happy hour and you were just listening to conversations and somebody would say, so tell me about yourself. And that simple question, which we all get asked, I don't know, hundreds of times, people don't know how to answer it. And when you said that, I was like, do I know how to answer that? I don't know.
Yes, you're right. Somebody said to me the other day, it's a terrible question. Like, tell me about yourself. Like, you know, we all could say so many different things. And I get it. I don't think it's a great question either, but now I think actually the openness of it does allow you to be strategic in your response, because really you have control over what you want to talk about. Do you want to talk about your career? Do you want to talk about your personal life? Are you trying to make a change? And this is an opportunity to tell someone who can help you, you know, your story and connect the dots and help them see where you're trying to go. So I think that, I do think a lot of people dread that question, and I think most of us kind of mumble something and try to move on as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. But I think when you're strategic about it, you can actually really use that response to your advantage.
So let's go real time here. Like, Priya Sam, tell us about yourself. How do you answer that question? How do you encourage
Yes,
that?
I love it. Thank you. So now I answer that question by saying I help people understand the power of their personal stories. And if this is somebody who maybe I want to work with, I'll ask them, like, yeah, like, is that something you've ever thought about? And then, some people will be like, oh, yeah, but most people are like, well, I don't know. I don't really know if I have a story, or I don't, I'm not comfortable talking about myself. I hear that a lot too.
Yeah,
And
I
I'm like,
find
yeah,
that to be true.
yes. Yeah.
Most people aren't
so then
willing to like open up and like share who they really are in like a context of, professionalism or your career. Like they keep that so much separate and hidden, but it really drives and motivates everything that we do.
Yes. And it's where so much of our confidence comes from too. And I think that's the connection that I have a 6-week program that I offer. And as I was planning the program, I did these sort of primary research interviews with people who I thought would be good candidates. And I was asking them, what are some of your pain points? What are things that you'd like to work on? And most of these were women who were like 5 to 10 years into their careers. And every single one of them said confidence. Like, I feel like I lack confidence in talking about myself. And I think so much of our confidence is tied to our personal stories, because it's the thing that, whether you consciously think about it or not, you have to talk about all the time. You meet someone new, you have to tell them some part of your story. You're in a job interview, you have to tell them something. You're out with your spouse at their work event. Someone's meeting you for the first time. You have to talk about yourself. And I think when we don't feel confident in our own experiences, when we don't feel that we have something special to offer, which everyone does, then it can really impact just those day-to-day interactions that you have too. So what I really try to work on from the beginning, even if I'm working with someone in a professional capacity, let's say on a keynote, I try to start with that personal element. What are the most pivotal moments in your life? And for me, that's a great starting point, because we all have those moments, right? I'm sure you're both right now thinking about, oh yeah, like this would be a pivotal moment for me. This was a turning point. This was an event that happened that changed everything. And that, I think, is actually a great place to start when it comes to that kind of confidence building and starting to think about your own story.
Yeah.
No doubt. And I love what you said too about it's essentially knowing your audience. So when you are delivering that story, who are you talking to? And how are they going to receive it, and what could come of it? So I recently had the pleasure of listening to one of your webinars, which, for anybody who's listening, go do that. Go listen to Priya. She's awesome. But one thing that really stood out for me, especially in the context of what Jason and I do for work, is most great careers are not built just on talent or hard work, but on the mutual exchange benefits. Mm-hmm. And this was something that men are often more comfortable with than women. And so this was a quote from How Women Rise. But literally, this is our job, is to find those mutual exchange benefits as partner professionals. So I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on this quote and what it means to you, and how we as individuals can frame this to grow our careers, but also help our companies.
Yes. It's so important. I think you can be so good at your job. You can be an expert. But if you don't have that strategy where you're thinking about, if you are trying to move to get to the next step, get a promotion, if you aren't thinking about how do I tell this story and how do I find people where my success is mutually beneficial to them, right? Mm-hmm. I think that we can get trapped in this idea that, I don't want to ask someone for a favor, or I don't want to ask someone to advocate for me because I'm putting a lot on them. I think we really need to reframe that and say, well, if I'm asking my boss to advocate for me and then I get promoted, guess what? My boss looks good too. So this is mutually beneficial, in the world of partnerships, you might be trying to bring on someone as a partner, but I'm sure there's always that mutual benefit. They're going to benefit from being connected to your company, to your team, to your services as well. And I think it can feel a lot more comfortable to make those, to pitch those partnerships, to start building that foundation of trust when you start from a place of, hey, this is mutually beneficial, not I'm trying to convince you to do something that's going to help me. Mm-hmm. And then the second part of that you asked was, About, sorry, I had
No,
another
that's
thing that I was
okay.
going to say.
It was,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's one thing that we talk about a lot, Jason and I do, about how we as partner professionals are out in the world networking and telling our stories, and it naturally benefits our companies. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people get hung up on is like me building my network and me going out and telling my story I don't see the value in that because it's not my job, when foundationally that is the job. So
Yeah. Well, I think like your story too, like to your point, like not only is where your confidence comes from, but it's also like where you begin to establish like that first layer of trust, right? When you're vulnerable enough and willing enough to open and share your story and talk about more of the personal context and this mutual benefits exchange, right? Like you start to establish trust out the gate when you can go there. And, you know, to Sam's point, like I do, like I intentionally weave that into, you know, the first 30 days, if we want to talk about that, whether it's working with new partners or managing new teams, it's like I bring in the person of who I am and who I'm working with to begin to establish that credibility with each other. So like, do you have any like exercises or questions you lead to guide people down that path to help them kind of understand that as well?
Yes, I think especially if I know something about the person that I'm trying to build this relationship with ahead of time, the first thing I try to look for is a mutual point of connection. And sometimes I'll even strategize a little on my ahead of that call. You know, I have a story that I think will resonate with this person. So I'm going to try and find a way to tell it. So I'm going to ask them a question that I want to answer. You know, so maybe I see that they had an interesting career path that's similar to mine. So I'm going to ask them, oh, how did you know, hey, like I was looking at your LinkedIn. I saw that you've worked in a couple of other industries. How did you end up working, let's say in tech? Then they're going to tell me their story. And chances are after they're going to say, oh, what about you? Like, how did you end up working here? And then it gives me the chance to tell the story that I have kind of already planned a little bit in my head, knowing that that's going to be a place to connect. So I do think those points of mutual, you know, having that commonality is a great place to start. I also think that we don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about ourselves to an audience that is genuinely listening. So I think there's a lot of value in really showing someone you're listening to. And instead of just saying, you know, oh, that's really interesting, saying, wow, you know, when that particular part of your story, when you talked about, you know, taking a leave of absence and spending 3 months traveling in Southeast Asia, like that really resonated with me. It's something I've thought of too, but you're really showing like, no, I'm not just nodding along here because I want you to sign this contract at the end of the call. I'm actually listening to you and I actually care about your story and I'm pulling something very specific out that resonated with
Absolutely.
me. So, yeah.
I think there's a part two to like active listening, or, you know, we talk about flow, someone this like flow in conversation, and you can really accentuate that just by repeating like the last piece of information you heard, like repeating it in their language, in their words and what they said, and it just kind of reiterates to them that, oh, this person is listening. They repeated back exactly what I just said, and it's as easy as that, right? Just by being engaged enough to ask a question back around what they said.
Yes. And that also, the feeling that's generated for the other person when you do that feeling of validation and, oh, I'm actually being heard, that is something that people remember feelings and how you made them feel. So I think that is another really important tie-in to that active listening.
Yeah, no doubt. And, you know, to the next point of that is like from trust comes value, and like value comes from like you being able to, you know, show some sort of worth through the conversation, right? And you get that through the active listening, like, oh, this person valued my time. He made me feel valuable. You know, if you walk away from that with the first call, then like you're well on your way to establishing a great relationship.
No doubt.
Yes. And you're picking up those nuggets that you can use, you know, even a first meeting, you know, maybe you just are getting to know someone a little bit, and then later you're talking more about working together or the partnership or the sales side of things. You have these personal nuggets that you can use in that presentation to tailor it to them. to make them, for me, a lot of when I'm doing demos, for example, in sales, it's like, how do you make your customer the hero of your story? And I find some of those personal elements, or knowing a little bit more about someone's day to day, for example, like when you can insert those down the road into those future conversations, it also makes such a big difference.
Yeah, I think I could spend the rest of the podcast just talking about how you actually make the customer the hero of the story from like your perspective and the work that you bring to the table. I think, but for the sake of the conversation, we'll keep going down the track of where we're at. Let's talk about networking for a second, or networks. It's been kind of a common theme here for the last few episodes, but I think I saw somewhere that you mentioned like hard work is not enough, but a network is essential to your success. So we just had Scott Leese on the podcast and a few others who were talking about go to network and establishing your network and community. Love to hear from you how you found success building a network, and not only just building it, but being able to activate it for your success in your business.
I think the best example of this is when I was leaving journalism and looking for a job in another industry actually at the time, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But I knew that the things I wanted to continue doing were storytelling and presenting, and that I loved like meeting people and learning new things. So as I kind of had these core pieces that I liked, but I didn't really know what other industry are these skills going to be applicable for. And so I started reaching out to other former journalists and just asking, hey, are you open to a 15-minute call or a coffee or a lunch? I would love to just hear about your career transition. And most of them actually worked in PR or comms. It's kind of a natural path for journalists to follow. And what I found was I just wasn't getting excited about those career paths personally. And so then I met this woman who worked in at a tech company, and she worked. She was a solutions consultant, so a solutions engineer, same job as I have now. And she started telling me about her role. Like, yes, I use storytelling all the time in my presentations. I get to learn about all of these interesting companies, and kind of match what their goals are to the use cases that our product has. I'm constantly like presenting to different executives. There's some traveling involved. All of these presenting storytelling skills that I really loved in this whole new way. And so for me in that moment, like my network became so important because first of all, it's how I met her, but then also I really needed her to kind of sell my skill set to her bosses and convince them to take a chance on someone with this unusual background. And then once I connected with them, they wanted to talk to other people in my network too. So in that period of time in particular, I would say it was about 6 to 8 months where I was really trying to meet new people and form connections outside of my industry. That's when I really realized the value of my network and the power of having other people advocate for me. And that mutual benefit piece came into play there too, where I was also able to help this friend, and people get compensated on referrals, right? So like there were definitely some pieces in there that ended up being mutually beneficial, which was also really great.
I've heard you tell this story before, and I loved the aspect. I have actually thought about this a lot, about finding someone who you admire or want to be like, and then talking to them about how they got there. Like, duh. It seems so simple, but I think, as we grow in our careers and we progress, it's often like, well, I don't know. I don't know. And it's not having clarity on A, what our goals are, and B, who we want to be. But I loved your perspective on finding somebody who you think is interesting and then having a conversation with them, because it sounds like for you, it helped you kind of define that and gain clarity around where you were going. Is that true?
Absolutely. And I would have never heard about this role if it wasn't for that conversation. Like I had no idea. My world was TV and journalism. I didn't really know. And then, public relations and communications people, I knew their jobs because I dealt with them a lot as a journalist, but I didn't know anything about the world of tech or sales. And so, yeah, I mean, it kind of is that like you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And then, yeah, so you really do need sometimes in those situations, like you're almost doing research. But it really opened my eyes up to, oh, I actually do have skills that are transferable, because I think I was really worried about that too. I mean, working in TV seems like such a specific skill set, and I just didn't know if anyone outside of the industry would ever see the value in what I had to offer. So this process helped build confidence for me too, that my skills would be transferable and that somebody else would see the value in them.
Actually, I think after meeting you and after hearing that, Jason and I were having a conversation, and I did ask him, I was like, I forget how I phrased it, but I was like, who are the top 3 people you want to be like? And he answered pretty off the cuff. Do you remember who your answers were?
I'm pretty sure it was Rich Roll, Simon Sinek, and maybe Ryan Reynolds. Very, very big, high, lofty goals, but those are the people I watch and I observe and I study. I don't just consume their content. I'm watching, I'm taking notes, I'm trying to learn from, and I think that's a great question. I've actually used it 2 or 3 times in my own conversations and asking people the same to help them kind of establish a North Star. And, I think it's a good guide to know, like, okay, we have these visions of who we want to be for ourselves, but who's done it, what's their path look like, and how can you kind of follow along, or at least, have some benchmarks to establish.
Yes. And those, now, this is one of the great things about social media is you can just get so much information from these people just by following them and consuming their content. Whereas, before that was like, you have to wait till they write a book or something and then buy the book and get a little piece of it. But I love the access we have, to people like that, too, that we can just learn from by following their content.
So one thing I want to double click on really quickly is, in your transition from journalism to tech, well, two things. A, that's not an obvious road. And I love this conversation we're having about, like, who do you admire, who's done it? Go learn about them, go read them. Because I feel like in this traditional world, we have these made up guardrails about, like, you have this job, which then leads to this, which then leads to this, and then you've made it and you're going to be happy.
Yes.
And if that works for you, amen, sister, go get it. But I also think conversations like this are so inspiring because it doesn't have to be linear. And these rules we put around our roles are literally made up. And if you can find people that have changed the script and have taken those risks and just get to know them, study them, it is absolutely possible. So I think that's a super refreshing perspective.
It really is. And I mean, I meet people all the time who are just doing what they're doing because they've always been good at it, but not because it's intentional. And then I think if you're doing that and you actually don't love what you do, everyone gets to a point where you're like, what am I doing? And it can feel a lot scarier to try and get out of it. The longer you're in it, or the more obligations you have, right? Whether it's a family or a mortgage or whatever it is. So I think taking that time to reflect as early as you can, and it's going to change over time too. I'm not trying to say it's ever too late because I don't think it is. But I do think taking that time to reflect at different points in your career is really important because, sometimes it is easy to just keep going down this path that's set out for us and without thinking about whether you're actually happy and fulfilled.
Totally.
I agree, and I feel like we've kind of had somewhat of a similar path. Do you feel like those transitions of like almost like career transitions are kind of we'll use the word superpower for you, or some sort of strength to pull from? Because like I started my career as a motivational speaker, right? Then I went into sales, and now I'm in partnerships, and each step, to your point, I've kind of reflected on, and I see the value that I've pulled from each and how it makes me good at what I do now. How has that worked for you in your current scenario?
Yes. Now I definitely see it as a superpower. I didn't, you know what, there was a period of time where I didn't, and I feel like,
Same.
you know what, yeah, like what got in my head actually for a while was, people used to say like, oh, you can't change jobs too often. It looks bad on your resume.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I would just, yeah, like that really got in my head at one point that, oh, people are going to think that I, don't actually invest myself in something, that I just like bop along from thing to thing, when like really it's not like that. There's so much more intention and thought behind it. But now that I'm doing what I do now, absolutely, I think it is my best superpower that I've done all of these different things, that all of the threads that I can pull from each of them, like it's like now I see this unique collection of skills that is so valuable. And I'm so happy I've done it that way. But it did take me a little while to kind of get to that point.
100, yeah, same, absolutely. And like I was a little insecure about it at first. It was like I was just doing like I just followed some passions. I was like, okay, I could go do this sales thing. That seems interesting. Then I got really into like the idea of marketing, helping a certain, types of businesses do marketing. And then someone introduced me to partnerships, and all of a sudden, like when I got into partnerships, I was like, man, another transition. But then I saw like I followed my passions, which became this path. And once I went down this path and began to follow those things, it led me right to where I'm at now. And like all those things, the motivational speaking, being able to speak in public and being an evangelist, to sales. And I have to carry quota and run revenue and marketing. I have to be able to run co-marketing initiatives with partners. Like all that has led up to this. And from going from an insecurity to a superpower is something that I never saw it coming. But when it hit me, I was like, oh, this is where it's at. And now, I see the power in being a generalist versus being someone who's very specific in what they do. And I know that comes into tech as well, and like what you do from not only from like the SE perspective, but also in like the coaching perspective. You have such a range to pull from.
Absolutely. And for me, that storytelling piece every single career has like been such an important part of it. Like I actually taught ESL for a little while in South Korea, and storytelling was even such a big part of that, because a lot of my students had never left the country and they didn't have any friends who were from anywhere else. They, it's quite a homogenous country. And so for me, like telling them about like my life in Canada, or how my parents ended up immigrating from India to Canada, it was all storytelling that really helped them to understand that. So it's really something that has been part of every transition. It has become a superpower in every career I've had. And I don't even think I realized that though until like the last few years, when I really started to think about it.
So, I mean, I think there's so much to talk about here, because no one is unique in that. If you don't have imposter syndrome, call me and tell me how. But it's like we all have these unique paths, and truly, if you open the hood, none of them are linear, as much as you try to say they are. And so when you work with clients, how do you help them like piece all these pieces together to get over this imposter syndrome and really showcase like exactly what you two just talked about? What I have is valuable, and here's how it can help you.
Yes. So I always start with this exercise where I get people to, and like in a group, I've done this in workshops, and I do it in my program too, but we do it live. Like I'm turning on some music. You're going to do this right now. You have like, 6 or 8 minutes, and you're going to write down all of the most pivotal moments in your life. And I think this is a great place to start, because once you might maybe in a week or a month think about those moments here and there. But when is the last time you actually sat down and looked at your whole life and wrote all of these things down, right? Like for most people don't do that. So that exercise I find is really powerful, because for most people it's a little slow. And then all of a sudden it's just like, I have 20 things I can write down here. So that's where I start. And then we start to pick, okay, like let's pick, 5 or 6 of the ones that stand out to you the most. And what are the life lessons you've learned from them? And once you go into that, you really start to realize, okay, not only did this thing happen that changed my life, but it taught me something that impacted who I am. Mm-hmm. And then you connect it to like, what characteristic do you see in yourself that comes from that? And I think that's where the confidence piece comes from. And in a group, it's really nice to do in a group setting because everyone starts to share. And inevitably, you find some commonalities with other people, but you also find things that are completely different and unique to you that other people tell you, like, oh, that's so interesting. Or I've known you for 3 years and I didn't know that about you. That's so fascinating. And so I think that exercise is really powerful. So I think starting with just writing down those pivotal moments for yourself is a really good place to start, because I think everyone will always find something that is different or unique that they will realize in that process.
And
One of the
I think
things I
too,
love-
whether it's good,
Go ahead.
I say whether it's good or it's bad, like you've gone through those things. You've gone through, something great that was pivotal in your life, but also like I can think of some moments in my life that weren't so good, that were bad, but I made it through those times, and that became a very pivotal point in my life. So it's important for those people to focus on both the good and the bad and see how it's shaped you and how you've come out of those scenarios, better and stronger.
That's what I was going to say is I feel like, Jay, those moments have been some of the moments that have built the strongest connections and friendships for you, because you've double tapped on them and found people who have gone through similar situations. But Priya, the one thing that people may come to you because they want to be able to tell their story better outwardly. But I think a byproduct of what you're helping people do is change the story they're telling to themselves. And that's so huge. And it definitely helps with the confidence perspective. But if we can't understand our own story and tell it in a way that's beneficial to us, then there's no way we can go out into the world and confidently, bring that story forward.
Absolutely. Especially if you're someone who maybe has tried to share your story or a part of your story with someone, and maybe you didn't get the best response the first time you did it. Like, that's not going to make you want to do it again, So I think what I try to create, especially, in a group environment, is a situation where everyone is comfortable opening up and you have that safe space to share your story. You kind of, like you're all in it for the same reason too, right? So I think doing it with a group of people who want to do it together is really helpful, because then you get the opportunity to practice as well. And once you tell something over and over again, you feel better about it. You feel confident in it. You're getting this validation. And then when you go out and you do it in a more organic setting, like a networking event, if someone doesn't necessarily respond to you the way you want them to one time, it's not going to affect you, because you've had all of this like positive reinforcement around it. So you're like, okay, my story wasn't meant for this person. That's okay. I can move on. And I know that it's already been meant for other people. Other people have responded well to it. So I think that that part of the confidence in that repetition and the validation from other people is really important in building something that's sustainable too.
No doubt. And I really find what you're doing so interesting, because the dichotomy of your day-to-day work and what you're doing with priyasam.com are definitely intertwined. But I've heard you talk about this, and I want you to share like how you're leveraging your current circumstances to elevate your ability to tell your own story more and reach your own goals more. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think I might have told you the story, Sam, when I met you, but I was at at Salesforce. I got moved onto a new team last year, and I didn't know anyone, and then we all got sent to New York, all the new people on this team, and it was like, okay, your executives are there, your teammates are there, like this is your chance to meet everyone, do some training, and my goal for this past year has been to speak at more conferences and events on behalf of the company. And previously I had a manager who was very supportive. He was like advocating for me. And now I'm on this new team where I don't know anyone. So I was very intentional about going into this event. Every executive I talk to, I'm going to tell them about my background in journalism, and I'm going to tell them about my goal to do more speaking. And I'm going to connect the dots for them. And so I did that. But I saw a lot of people around me not leveraging that opportunity because they didn't know how, right? And so they would get asked a question. Like I remember one in particular, when a colleague, she used to live in Denver, somebody asked her, hey, I know you used to live in Denver. How'd you end up in New York? And she was like, oh, I just always wanted to live here. So I moved here and yeah, just made it happen. And after I was like, okay, tell me the real story. And she said, well, I graduated. I'd always dreamed of living in New York, but like I didn't have a job. I didn't really have any money. So I, packed a couple suitcases, went and slept on my friend's couch, applied to 200 jobs, finally got one in sales. That was like 5 years ago. And now she's like crushing it at a massive company. And I was like, where was that story? That story, if you had told that story, that executive would have been like, wow, you're resilient, you're open to taking risks, willing to try new things. Like those are the connections that they're making. So that really started to make me realize like there are people that in my circle right now that need this. So I actually created a workshop that I started doing with some of the ERGs, the employee resource groups at Slack and Salesforce. So I've been able to kind of mix these two things, like this sort of side passion into my 9 to 5. And a lot of the people I work with have been finding value in it. And actually they've given me some great ideas for other things to do with it, or like I did this for like the women's group at Slack. And then somebody in our Black employees group was like, you know what? I think that this is something that would be really valuable for our team. Like, could you come do it for this group? So I do feel that I've been able to kind of use my existing network and work situation also to try out some of these concepts that are leading to opportunities outside of Salesforce too.
I love that. I mean, what's coming to mind for me is maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but that old ad where there's a hitchhiker and it says, his first sign says need a ride and his second sign says trying to get to mom's for Thanksgiving. And it changes the entire perspective on who that person is. You go from like, could be homeless, could be a drug user to, oh, really wholesome guy that's wanting to go home. And like your aptitude to helping is changing significantly. And that's the value of coming to people with your story, because it makes you relatable. It makes people want to help you. It makes you personable, all of these things. And I think we just get hung up on our own head of no one cares.
Yes. Yeah. And like, oh, I don't have anything that stands out. Yeah, that's such a good example of how like the same situation presented a different way just resonates and hits completely differently.
Totally.
100%. I want to rewind on something you just mentioned a second ago. So you got super passionate or, curious about, people tell their stories. So did I catch that right? And that to initially get started, you started helping people internally at Salesforce and Slack and helping them better tell and craft their stories. So instead of like overthinking and trying to build a whole new community, you just tapped into those around you to get started and helping those build out, the stories they're telling throughout the day and begin essentially testing it in a free market there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I started doing. And then, I posted about it a couple of times on social media, and then some people from other companies reached out and said, hey, I think this would actually be really valuable at our company. Would you be open to doing a session here? And then the college I attended actually asked me to come do a workshop there for recent grads. So it's really kind of started to grow just from that initial idea. And I didn't know when I did that first workshop, like, is this actually going to be valuable? It was nice to do it in a safe space, but it also it was just a reminder of that. I mean, I know I don't want to sound cheesy, but if you don't try, you will never know, And so I'm so glad I just took that chance and tried. I mean, it could have flopped and the, 12 people who attended my first session might have been like, oh, that was like not great. But instead it turned into this thing that just has like continued to snowball from there. So I think sometimes those small ideas, like it's really worth it just to try and water that seed a little bit and see what happens.
Yeah, I think there's a lot for people to to learn in that. It's like, got a curiosity, got something you're super passionate about. And I am definitely one, and Sam can attest, I suffer from, analysis paralysis. How do I get started? Right? Hey, I'm going to mute you here in a second. So just getting started with those around you. right? I
Yes.
recently threw a post out about something I was thinking. Had a lot of people jump in, started testing some theories out, and next thing you know, I've got people that are interested in hearing more about kind of the ideas behind the LinkedIn post that I put out. So, get started with those you've got around you, test it, share it, get some more people involved, get some feedback, create that whole loop. And
Yes.
think
I mean, and getting this feedback from people you already know who are comfortable being honest with you is so helpful. Because like my first workshop wasn't perfect. There were things I needed to improve. And because I had that audience of people I already knew in some capacity, they told me, hey, I loved this. This part felt like it could have been a little smoother, or like the instructions in this part weren't super clear. Great. It was so perfect. So I think it's so easy when you're on social media to see the people who are here. You don't see that stuff. You don't see the testing with friends and family, the small groups, the free things they did at the beginning. And so it feels like if the first thing you do isn't up here, like, oh, I don't know if I'm cut out for this. But no, like every person started that way. Every person who has like audiences of thousands, tens of thousands, they all started with that small group of people they knew, or family, and friends. So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
yeah, so just getting started, it's crucial. Let's as you're helping people get started, I would like to dig into a little bit about kind of your process. I feel like I'm a student of storytelling, so this is more of like a personal curiosity.
Asking for a
like,
friend.
Yeah, there's a few friends that are listening that want to know, so they say. Talk us through like your strategic storytelling system. I think Sam and I were discussing that you have a system that you've kind of built out. You walk people through, share what you can, and love to learn a little bit from you there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so the system is clarity, confidence, storytelling, and strategy. And the clarity portion really has two parts. So it's clarity on your own story or stories, and then clarity on your goals. So I would say that most people I work with have something specific they're working towards. So maybe it's a keynote presentation that we're building. In my group program, it's more like trying to build out my network, trying to get a new job, trying to get a promotion. So I think having that clarity at the beginning is really important, because everything you do is going to connect to that. So it's almost like working backwards.
Gotcha.
The confidence piece happens through that whole system. Like I'm trying to still figure out the right way to design this graphic where confidence is like growing through the other three steps. But that comes from like the story discovery is a great place for the confidence to start growing. And then the practicing and telling of it is, as we talked about, is kind of where you really see it take off. But the storytelling piece, I would say, is the most structured part. So just learning those core concepts of a story. So what is your hook at the beginning? That first sentence that you're going to tell someone that's going to make them want to keep listening. The next part is personal details. And those are really details that connect to any of the five senses. So something that, again, it's going to make people like smell something, see something, hear something, really painting that picture for them that, again, will just help it to be memorable. And the last part is reminding them why the story was important, or stating your goal if this particular story is tied to that goal that you're trying to reach. So one example of that is like when I was at that networking event, these executives, I'm telling them like, so my hook is I'm asking them, hey, how did you end up working in tech? So they'll ask me. Then I tell them like, oh, I actually used to be a journalist and morning show host before, and I moved into tech because I love storytelling and presenting. And then at the end is, actually my goal this year is to do more speaking on behalf of the company at conferences and keynotes, or at conferences and events. So if there are any opportunities, I would love to hear about them. So that's kind of what it looks like in action. And that last piece is strategy. And that the strategy piece is creating those opportunities to tell those stories. So asking that question that you want to answer, for example, or being intentional about the people that you are talking to at events, doing that research ahead of time is also part of strategy if you are trying to do something specific.
I like that. So to reiterate, clarity, confidence, storytelling, and strategy.
Yes.
So in your storytelling, curiosity. Are you a framework or a fan of any frameworks out there, of any authors that you've kind of studied and learned from, and kind of helping others build out? It's like I've got books around storytelling from Donald Miller to Anne Lamont to all the other people out there about writing and telling stories and stuff like that. Like who are you learning from, or who have you learned from in the past that have guided you to build the steps out?
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. So many. But I know you mentioned Simon Sinek at the beginning. Also love him. Brene Brown is another one. Like I just love her, like the whole psychology behind it. So I'd say those are two of my favorites. But sometimes like I follow a lot of people who are keynote speakers, just like on social media. And sometimes people I don't know very well will just say something that like really kind of hits me differently, and all of these little tips, I feel like that I've kind of collected over the years, that as I was building out this system and kind of trying it out, because I did the same thing, just trying it out with people I was working with kind of casually, or in my earlier days when I was just figuring out how to help people become better speakers or presenters, for example. That really helped me, aside from trying my own theories, but those collections of tips from other people definitely really helped me to develop that system that so far has been working really well.
Love that. What would you say, so along those lines of your framework, what are some easy steps today that our listeners or viewers could take away today to start understanding the story they have to tell? Like if you had to say go do this, and then, dig into Priya Sam's content after that.
Yes.
Then go hire you.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm here for that. I love it. But yeah, you know what? I think the reflection on your own pivotal moments is a good place to start. The other thing that I think, once you're more intentional about looking for stories that stand out to you, that's also something that, you might scroll past something on LinkedIn or on Instagram and watch it and think, oh, that's interesting, but you'll just keep moving. But I think if you actually spend a few days just thinking about stories and how they show up in your life, that also can be really powerful, because you have to also believe in the power of storytelling, I think, before you do this work. And seeing it in action, and understanding the impact it has on you is a really great way to just see that value, rather than someone just telling you it's important. Even in your, advertisements you see, why did something stick with you when you think about that story piece of it? So I think looking for stories in your everyday life is also a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a few friends who kind of talk about, keeping files of your stories. So some people call it swipe files or whatever. Do you find yourself keeping swipe files, notes in your phone, or Evernote somewhere of all the stories that ooh, that's a good one. I want to keep that one somewhere so I can recall it later?
Yes, absolutely. So I also use Evernote, and then I still like to write sometimes, handwrite. So I'm a big journaler. So, and I actually have, I have my kind of daily journal. I mean, my let's call it my more frequent journal, because it's not quite daily. But then I also do have actually a notebook for stories that I try to jot things down in when they come up. And for me, there's something about the handwriting part of it that I really like too. It feels a little more like a bit of an outlet sometimes.
Yeah. So I have one last question. I promise I'll shut up. I'm just so curious about the process from people like yourself.
This is why I invited you to the podcast. I knew.
I love it.
As a journaler, I'm always curious to know what others' journaling process is like. Do you mind giving us just a overview of when you sit down to journal, what are you focused on? Are you just getting thoughts down? Do you have a framework, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, you know what? I've tried so many different things over the years. I tried the kind of bullet journaling for a while. I tried to write every day for a year, a couple of years ago. And that, I think I found that with that one, when I went back and read through, I found it a little bit harder to find the things that, would really stand out. Because some days were just, kind of average days. So one thing I've been doing now is I actually highlight my own writing. So if
I like that.
I don't, yeah, like I would say the actual formatting is kind of free flowing, but I will, because I am, thinking about what I might say in a podcast interview, or, there are times when I want to reflect back and maybe like look at how I've changed or how my story's changed. I do at the end of a journaling session kind of like look through and I highlight some of the important parts that I think might be important to me later. And I find that helpful. So every few months I do go back and look at those things. And in the last year, because I've had so much growth in my own storytelling and in working with people, I've actually noticed a big difference in the way I write and my own confidence growing about in it. Because when I started, I would say, I felt like I knew enough about storytelling, but I wouldn't say I was confident in the fact that I could help other people with it. And now when I'm writing about it, I notice like a change in my own tone and confidence writing about it, which is really cool.
Yeah,
like
that's great.
it's cool to notice that in yourself. Yeah.
That's what happens when you just get started.
Yes, absolutely. You are right.
So this conversation's been awesome, and I hope we get the chance to do it again. But I would really encourage our listeners, like you kind of talked about this, how you have to understand or believe in the power of storytelling before you can like embark on this journey successfully. And I feel like we can put storytelling in its own bucket when in actuality, like sales is storytelling, marketing is storytelling. Every conversation you have with a person is a chance to tell your story. And I think the opportunities for our audience to really lean into this are boundless. So that being said, Priya, if somebody is interested in working with you, where do they go? How do they do that?
Yeah, so you can find my website is priyasam.com, and there's like an option to fill out a contact form. So absolutely you can do that there. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there and on Instagram, and everything is Priya Sam. So I'm super easy to follow. Luckily, I don't have a super common name. So
Makes it very convenient.
So it's easy to find me. Yeah.
Well, so we like to end the podcast with a little bit of a question that's unrelated to our previous, so it's always a surprise. Don't worry, yours isn't hard. Being obsessed with storytelling and an expert in the field, from that perspective, what is your favorite movie due to the storyline?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I really loved Interstellar.
Okay.
Yes,
movie.
yes, because I feel like that one, it jumps around so much that it really like conceptually has the potential to be so confusing, but it's not, because they found this way to like draw all of these concepts and the imagery. So you can tell what point you're at because of like the scenery that's around you. And I think that this is something that's so crucial, especially when you're doing a longer, like let's say a 45-minute keynote. You have to go back and you have to remind people about the important parts of the story more than once.
Yeah.
And to me in that movie, there's a lot of like recalling back to like reminding you like, hey, this is where we are right now. And this is what happened before. And this is less jumping back and forth in time, and that bookshelf you'll recognize from earlier. So that's how you know where we are in this period of time. And so I think that that concept really translates well into like when I think about like stories now. But I loved that movie, and I wouldn't say I necessarily picked that out the first time I saw it, but then when I went back I was like, they did this very well, and this is a very important thing to do in a longer piece of media.
It's an interesting parallel to make, all pun intended there, to make it into the keynotes or marketing. It's like, if you're marketing something, like bringing it back in front of the person, bringing it back in front of the person. So keynotes, I keep iterating the point you're driving home. Like there's always a central theme of what you're driving home. So it's a good parallel to the movie there.
So great. Priya, this has been phenomenal. Thank you for the time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our friends who are asking. People,
thank you for having me. I could talk to you both all day. This was really great. So yeah, really appreciate the opportunity.
Let's absolutely do it again. Guys, go follow Priya. She knows her stuff. attend her webinars. She's definitely, she's got something special going on. So that's it for today, friends. Thank you again for you tuning in, giving us your time. We appreciate you immensely, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.